What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Sometimes you look at a Pokemon game and wonder, just how did they cram so many ideas into one region? Well, I think Black and White probably qualify on the number of Pokemon alone, giving us the most ever. Now, some would argue they weren't wholly original inspirations, but Unova still gave a good mix of Pokemon of varying stages, as well as single and dual types. However, what if there weren't any dual types allowed? Chalk it up to maybe trying even harder for the reboot angle if you want, but let's see how each Generation 5 Pokemon might shake out if they had to rely on just a single type. And for the first and only time, we will start with not a grass starter in Victini. This mythical comes first in the dex here, so we can just jump in and call it a fire type. I'm basing this on the so-called infinite power that it can apparently generate, and while there can be psychic-based energy, I think fire more easily slots into the role of a victorious power plant. Plus it lines up with its signature attack, Searing Shot, so I think fire is the obvious choice. Now the Snivy line is already a single type, so how do we handle the Tepig evolutions? See, Pignite is one of the worst Pokemon ever created, but what type should an atrocity even be? I know it's got a wrestling leotard on, but I still think fire works best. And this will carry over to Emboar as well. It's got a flaming beard after all, and keeping it fire just works way better because the Oshawott line also stays one type. So throwing in a random fighting type wouldn't help anybody because it messes with the other starters too much. Then it's another 15 Pokemon until we finally hit Pidove, and this line will easily be flying. It might not be super exciting, but the birds clearly embody flying more than they do normal. I mean, neither normal gym leader used them, but Skyla had them all over her gym, so it's clear that the sky is calling their name. Less clear is the Woobat line, who could go either way, but I'm leaning towards Psychic, largely due to the sound waves that it emits allegedly being able to affect a person's mood, so it seems to have some form of mental manipulation capabilities at the very least. Of course, Drillbur evolves into Excadrill, and I think Steel is a requirement here. The defining trait of this Pokemon is the metal plates that have grown to make it better at digging and attacking, so if we're gonna make them go through the trouble of evolving at all, we might as well give it the Steel type to make it unique. Next we have Palpitoad, who I would leave water. It doesn't really change too much from Tympole, just grows some feet, so I think it would still be more at home in the water than on land. However, I think when it evolves, Seismitoad could actually get away with ground. It becomes a full land dweller at this point, named after earthquakes no less, plus it kinda balances out when we got rid of a ground type from earlier. And then I would actually do a similar thing with Sewaddle, where I would keep the base stage bug type, because it's a general weakling worm thing that we see everywhere, but once it evolves into Swadloon, we can switch it to grass, where it literally wraps itself in a plant-based Snuggie. And we would maintain that in Leavanny, sort of turning it into a Proto-Lurantis with an insect-looking grass type. And looking at the Venipede line, we'll probably do the same thing, where we start out with Bug, but once it evolves into Whirlipede, it switches over to Poison. Still learning Bug-type attacks, of course, with Scolipede being the big bad Poison type at the end, like an insectoid centaur. Oh yeah, after that, Cottony and Whimsicott got the Fairy type added to them in Gen 6, and I think it makes sense for them to go that way with their solo typing as well. Firstly, we have seen plant Fairy types without grass attached before, so that's not a problem, but secondly, keeping them Fairy does a great job to set them apart from their pure grass counterparts. Otherwise, why make them different Pokemon at all? Sandile would become Ground, I don't think that's too confusing to track. They're desert crocodiles after all, and the darkest thing about them is honestly their sunglasses, but that doesn't make Ash's Squirtle suddenly a dark type. So I doubt most people would complain that Crocodile gets to be a solid ground type. While Darmanitan is pure fire, the Zen mode becomes the psychic type, so we can easily drop the fire to justify the form change happening at all. Which takes us to Dwebble, who I think would work as a bug type, but then when it becomes a Crustle, it would take on the rock type. I mean, Crustle gets buried under a massive chunk of rock when it evolves, so getting overtaken by that type works for me. Just like Parasect back in Gen 1. Plus, that is a big change from bug to rock, so I would be interested to see how that works out for them. And I kind of think the same thing should happen for Scraggy, with it being fighting initially, but changing to dark when it becomes Scrafty. I mean, this is basically the same premise as Pancham, right? Scraggy is a bit mischievous, but that wasn't enough to turn the panda until it evolved, and once we get a Scrafty, it becomes determined to be a lot more punk. Sigilyph is a little tough because it's so weird, but I think we could settle on flying because it has so many wings, and to set it apart from the bats from earlier. Then we have the classic fossils, where we lose the rock typing, making Caracosta a water type and Archeops a flying type. That's enough explanation there, I think. But don't worry, we will be removing flying when we jump down to the ducklet line and keeping them water. I mean, we've got plenty of other pure water ducks, so they fit right in with their brethren. Now, I really like the idea of Deerling being normal, but then having Saucebuck become a grass type. Deerling just kind of changes colors, which doesn't necessitate any plant basis, but Saucebuck has literal leaves on its head, and becoming one with nature over time works really well with the theme of this Pokémon, and I just think it would be fun to see. Okay, so Emolga is the first Pikachu clone to appear on these lists, and I think it's pretty obvious that to uphold their unique traits, these Pokémon should shift to their secondary typing, keeping it as a flying squirrel. But of course it can still learn electric attacks. Let's see, Escavalier should be Steel, that's an easy choice to set it apart from its bug-type partner, and the Fungus line should probably be Poison, because that fits well with their toxic spores, and it keeps up the pattern of mushrooms always being a different type that we've got going, so that's fun. Frillish and Jellicent should stay Water, because honestly, they weren't even supposed to be ghost types in the first place. Joltik and Galvantula seem more electric to me. Their hair is standing on end from their charge, and honestly, it would just be really cool to have some electric types that aren't just your standard mammals. And one of the most obvious to me is the Ferrothorn line being Steel. I mean, if the spikes weren't green, nobody would even think of them as grass types anyway, so Solid Steel works. And then with the Litwick family, I would say Fire is fine. It's not like they lack any ghostly qualities, but that's mostly from their lore and not necessarily design. I could easily see these open flames just being fire types without having to burn up souls or whatever. Plus, we seriously lack 3-stage fire types outside of the starters, so we cannot afford to lose them. Stunfisk, I don't really care, but Ground, I guess. The only reason it was electric was to check off that type combination, but we don't have those in this scenario, so the Mudfish gets to stay muddy. Who I care much more about is the Golurk line, who will also be ground types. These titans made of clay could have a sort of natural power source, it doesn't have to be otherworldly, so I could easily see them dropping Ghost. Although that doesn't really leave a whole lot of ghosts left in Unova, sorry. And in like manner, I feel the same about Bisharp with it staying a steel type. There's not very much dark about these chess pieces that are covered in blades, so it seems to speak for itself if you ask me, as does Rufflet, who should really stay a flying type, because they are clearly very proud of being birds, but also it makes them different from the Vullaby line, who will remain dark instead. This way the birds aren't redundant, and they can bring their own different attributes to the table. Durant. Durant was actually pretty hard because it could easily fall into either category, but I think to remain consistent with Galvantula from earlier, it should be a steel type. After all, its durability is its most important trait, apparently, and someone could have made a metal sculpture that just happens to look like an ant. Either way, Durant is thrilled to no longer be quad weak to heat more. Then we have the Pseudo-legendary line, and I was gonna do Dragon initially, but now I think they should stay Dark. We've taken a bit of the Dark pool already, but there's also an existing line of 3 Dragon Pokémon that you can find earlier and easier in Gen 5, so I don't think anyone is going to bother using Dino if they were a surplus pure dragon, meaning that Dark is a better way of letting these multi-headed Pseudo-legends showcase their shadier impulses. And of course that just leaves Larvesta, who I would make a bug type. But I think once again Volcarona will switch over to fire. Larvesta is just a larva, while Volcarona blossoms into the embodiment of the sun. Plus, it's somehow kind of become a thing this time around for bugs to change when they evolve, so I like it. And then I would say that we only have the legendary Pokémon now, but there are so many of them, it's not really close to the end, because they're basically all dual-typed. Anyway, the Swords of Justice are first, and I won't say that you have to have fists to become a fighting type, but the materials that they're made of seem a bit more interesting so that they don't just all blend together. They could still share that unifying fighting signature attack, though. And of course, this can carry over to Keldeo as well. I know that's out of order, but it really shouldn't be. The only monotyped legend in Unova is Tornadus, who is flying, so I think that makes it pretty obvious that Thundurus has to be electric and Landorus needs to be ground. Otherwise, why would they have 3 different flying legends that are all the same buff guy? We didn't even do that for the birds. Now, as for the box art Pokémon, yeah, they are dragons, but so is Charizard, so you don't need the type to have draconic features. And honestly, I think the dragon was mostly added just to make them feel powerful and special. But that could still be achieved by making Reshiram a white-hot, burning personification of heat, while Zekrom can easily pull off being the jet-black power generator, causing near-constant overloads. I don't see it as a huge conflict with Thundurus since they fill different roles, so they can both be electric types. And of course that makes Kyurem a strong ice type. That does beg the question what the fusion forms would become, but I am leaning towards Kyurem stealing the types from the others, giving this one Pokémon 3 different types. So all that's left are the mythicals like Meloetta, and since people see normal as the de facto sound type, I think we could drop this singer's psychic typing no problem, but then have her change to fighting in the other form. Otherwise, why bother shifting at all? And lastly, we see Genesect, and I'm going with Bug here. Firstly, we have confirmation that this Pokémon is only wearing armor and not made of metal like some others, but more importantly, this is the first legendary bug type in the entire franchise, and the only one really if you don't count Ultra Beasts and Paradox forms, so we are not going to take away Bug's biggest achievement, and Genesect will stay firmly in that column. So those are all of the black and white Pokémon with just a single element. Water once again surges strong, only losing 1 Pokémon, but Fire also held on pretty tightly to its spot, and I was also impressed with Steel as well. Unfortunately, we took every ghost possible, leaving it dead even with a type that didn't even exist in Gen 5. But how would you make all of the Unova Pokémon a single type? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded!